Imagine lying down and drifting into a peaceful sleep, while centuries of battles, kingdoms, and legends unfold before your eyes. What if the rise and fall of entire civilizations could be told in a way that brings you comfort rather than chaos? Close your eyes and let's journey through the entire history of the Crusader States. A tale of conquest, faith, and kingdoms lost to time. Ready to dream with history? The Crusader States, often remembered for their dramatic rise and tragic fall, began with a dream of reclaiming the Holy Land. The First Crusade, called by Pope Urban II in 1095, marked the beginning of this ambitious quest. But before we dive into the rise of the Crusader States, let's take a step back and look at what led to this pivotal moment in history. In the late 11th century, the Christian world was shaken by reports that the Muslim Seljuk Turks had captured Jerusalem. This news sent shockwaves through Europe, a place where the Holy Land held immense religious significance. Jerusalem was more than just a city. It was the cradle of Christianity, where Jesus Christ had lived, died, and was resurrected. For Christians, this was a city that belonged to them, and they believed it was their sacred duty to reclaim it. Pope Urban II saw this moment as a call to action. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, he called upon knights, lords, and peasants alike to take up arms and journey to the east to liberate Jerusalem. He promised them spiritual rewards, salvation, and the forgiveness of sins for anyone who participated in the crusade. This powerful message resonated with many, and soon, the streets of Western Europe were filled with men preparing for a journey that would change the course of history. The First Crusade began in 1096, and it was a long and difficult journey. Thousands of knights and soldiers, driven by faith and the promise of glory, marched through Europe and into the Middle East. After years of battles, sieges, and hardships, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. The city was taken after a brutal siege, and the Crusaders established control over Jerusalem, setting the stage for the creation of the Crusader States. These new states were formed as a result of the Crusaders' military conquests. The Crusader States were essentially Christian kingdoms established in the Levant, and they included places like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These states were not only strategically important, but also deeply symbolic. They were a testament to Christian resilience and their ability to fight for what they believed in. But the formation of these states wasn't without challenges. The Crusaders, though united in their mission, had different ideas about how the Holy Land should be governed. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the largest and most important of the Crusader states, and it was a symbol of Christian power in the region. But the other states, though smaller, were no less significant. Each Crusader state had its own unique history, and all faced external threats, internal divisions, and the constant struggle to hold on to the land they had fought so hard to claim. As we continue, we'll explore how the Crusader states grew, how they navigated relationships with local populations, and how the balance of power shifted over the years. The story of the Crusader states is one of ambition, faith, and survival, but it's also a story of inevitable decline, as the dream of Christian kingdoms in the East began to fade. After the success of the First Crusade, the Crusader states began to flourish. They were new, fragile, and faced constant threats from both external and internal forces. The Crusaders, now firmly established in the Levant, worked quickly to solidify their hold on the lands they had captured. Yet their victory was only the beginning of a complex and often turbulent history. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which stood at the heart of the Crusader states, was founded by Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the leaders of the First Crusade. Godfrey became the first ruler of Jerusalem, though he refused the title of king and instead called himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a title that reflected his religious devotion. His reign marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Crusader states, but it also highlighted the challenges they would face in maintaining control over a region that had long been dominated by other civilizations. The Crusader states were not just fighting Muslims for control of the Holy Land, they also had to contend with other political and military powers. The Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire to the north, viewed the Crusaders with a mixture of skepticism and suspicion. Though both the Byzantine and Crusader forces shared a common faith, The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as potential rivals for control over the eastern Mediterranean. Tensions between the two sides were high, and the Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, sought to exert influence over the Crusader States whenever possible. Despite these challenges, the Crusaders managed to create a strong military and political presence in the Levant. The Crusader States, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, began to build fortifications and castles to protect their territory. The famous Crusader castles, such as those at Cracte Chevaliers and Margat, were constructed during this time, and they became symbols of Christian dominance in the region. These castles not only served as military strongholds, but also as administrative centers, reinforcing the Crusaders' authority. Over time, the Crusader states developed a system of government and administration that was heavily influenced by European feudalism. The rulers of these states were often knights or nobles who had fought in the Crusade, and they governed over lands granted to them by the King of Jerusalem or other rulers. These nobles, in turn, granted land to their vassals, and the structure of feudal society became entrenched in the region. However, despite their military successes and political organization, the Crusader states were constantly under threat. The Muslim world, led by various empires and dynasties, was determined to reclaim the land that had once belonged to Islam. The Crusaders' control of Jerusalem was especially symbolic, and many Muslim rulers saw it as their sacred duty to expel the Christians from the city. One of the most notable early Muslim leaders to challenge the Crusader states was the famous general and sultan, Saladin. Saladin, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, was determined to restore Muslim control over Jerusalem. His military prowess and strategic genius made him a formidable opponent for the Crusaders. In 1187, Saladin launched a campaign to recapture Jerusalem, and after a fierce siege, he succeeded in reclaiming the city from the Crusaders. This marked the beginning of a period of instability for the Crusader states. The loss of Jerusalem was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but also psychologically. The Crusaders had believed that their conquest of Jerusalem was a divine mission, and its loss marked a significant turning point in their fortunes. Yet, despite this setback, the Crusader states did not fall immediately. The battle for the Holy Land was far from over, and the Crusaders would continue to fight for control of the region for many more years. As we move forward, we'll explore how the Crusader states responded to these early challenges, and how they tried to rebuild and maintain their presence in the Levant. Despite facing relentless opposition from the Muslim world, the Crusader states were at their peak in the 12th century, but their dominance was always under threat. While the Crusaders were busy consolidating their power in the Holy Land, a new force was emerging in the Muslim world, one that would challenge the Crusader presence more fiercely than ever before. That force was Saladin. Saladin, born in Tikrit, modern-day Iraq, rose to power as a military commander and later became the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. His goal was to unify the Muslim world under one banner, and he quickly gained fame for his military genius and his pious dedication to Islam. His success wasn't just limited to military strategies. Saladin's appeal came from his vision of uniting the Muslim world against the foreign invaders of the Crusader states. At the time of Saladin's rise, the Crusader states were divided, often weakened by internal conflicts and competition between their rulers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, for instance, was often divided between different factions, some of which fought for dominance, while others struggled to maintain a united front against external threats. The internal struggles of the Crusader states made it easier for a determined leader like Saladin to find weaknesses in their defense. In 1187, after years of careful preparation, Saladin launched a full-scale military campaign against the Crusader states. His ultimate goal was to retake Jerusalem, a city that had become the spiritual and symbolic heart of the Crusader presence in the East. The Crusaders had already suffered some setbacks in the years prior, and their position was growing more precarious by the day. Saladin's campaign culminated in the siege of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Lusignan, put up a valiant defense, but they were no match for Saladin's superior strategy and forces. After a brief siege, Saladin's troops broke through the Crusader defenses. Jerusalem, the most prized city in the Holy Land, fell back into Muslim hands in October 1187. The loss of Jerusalem was a devastating blow to the Crusader States, both militarily and psychologically.
The city was not just a strategic target.
It was a symbol of Christian power and faith. Losing it meant losing the very heart of the Crusader dream. Saladin's victory was remarkable not only for its military success, but also for his generosity towards the defeated Crusaders. He allowed the Christian inhabitants of Jerusalem to leave the city peacefully, and even the Crusader soldiers who had been captured were treated with respect. This act of mercy, although unusual for the time, won Saladin admiration even from his enemies. For the Crusader States, the fall of Jerusalem was the beginning of a period of decline. The loss of the Holy City was a blow to Christian morale, and many Crusaders began to lose faith in the idea of a permanent Christian presence in the East. However, this didn't mean that the Crusaders gave up on their mission entirely. The Third Crusade, led by some of the most famous European rulers of the time, including Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, was launched in response to Saladin's victory. The Third Crusade focused on recapturing Jerusalem and restoring Christian rule. Although the Crusaders were able to win several important victories, including the capture of the city of Acre, they failed to retake Jerusalem. Instead, a truce was reached between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, which allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. While this was a small victory for the Crusaders, it was far from the decisive reclaiming of Jerusalem they had hoped for. Despite this setback, the Crusader states continued to exist for some time after the fall of Jerusalem. However, the momentum had shifted. The Crusaders were no longer the dominant force in the region, and their power was continually eroded by Saladin's successors and other Muslim dynasties. Over time, the Crusader states were pushed back, losing territory and influence. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187, followed by the failure of the Third Crusade to restore Christian rule, marked a major turning point in the history of the Crusader states. It set the stage for the eventual collapse of Christian power in the Holy Land. Yet, the story of the Crusader states was far from over. Despite their losses, the Crusaders would continue to fight for their presence in the Levant for nearly another century. After the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 and the subsequent failure of the Third Crusade to restore Christian rule in the Holy Land, the Crusader states were left in a vulnerable position. While they continued to control some coastal cities, their political and military power was gradually weakening. The Crusaders were no longer the dominant force in the Levant, and their hold on the region was becoming increasingly fragile. One of the key factors in the decline of the Crusader states was the rise of the Mamluks, a powerful military caste that would eventually replace the Crusaders as the primary force in the region. The Mamluks were originally slave soldiers of Turkic and Circassian origin, would have been brought to the Islamic world as military slaves, but eventually rose to power through military prowess and political maneuvering. By the mid-13th century, the Mamluks had established themselves as the ruling elite in Egypt and Syria. The Mamluks were fiercely committed to the defense of Islam, and they viewed the Crusader presence in the Levant as a major threat. With the Crusaders still holding important cities along the Mediterranean coast, the Mamluks saw it as their duty to rid the region of these foreign invaders. Under the leadership of Sultan Baybars, the Mamluks launched a series of military campaigns against the Crusader states, aiming to expel the Christians from the region once and for all. Baybars, who became Sultan of Egypt in 1260, was a brilliant military strategist. His armies were well-trained, well-equipped, and highly disciplined, making them a formidable opponent for the Crusaders. The Mamluks had already defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Angelut in 1260, and their power was growing rapidly. In the following years, Baybars turned his attention to the Crusader states, which were still holding on to cities like Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch. In 1265, Baybars launched a full-scale siege against the Crusader city of Acre, the most important remaining Crusader stronghold in the Levant. The Crusaders put up a determined defense, but they were no match for the Mamluk forces. After a brutal siege, Acre fell to the Mamluks in 1291, marking the end of Crusader rule in the Holy Land. The fall of Acre was the final blow to the Crusader states. and it marked the end of a nearly 200-year-long period of Christian rule in the Levant. The loss of Acre was devastating for the Crusaders. The city had been the last major Crusader stronghold, and its fall marked the complete collapse of the Crusader States. Many of the Crusaders who had been living in the region were forced to flee, and the dream of a Christian kingdom in the east came to an end. The Mamluks now controlled the entire Levant, and their power was firmly established in the region. Although the fall of Acre marked the end of the Crusader States in the Holy Land, it did not mark the end of Christian presence in the region altogether. The Crusaders did maintain a presence on some of the Mediterranean islands, such as Cyprus, which remained a Crusader stronghold for several more centuries. However, the Crusader states, as political entities, were effectively gone by the end of the 13th century. The rise of the Mamluks, and their eventual expulsion of the Crusaders from the Levant, is a testament to the resilience of the Muslim world. Despite the Crusaders' initial success and their establishment of powerful states in the region, the Mamluks were able to reclaim the Holy Land and drive the Crusaders out once and for all. Their victory was a symbol of the enduring strength of Islam in the face of foreign invasion, and it marked the final chapter in the history of the Crusader states. While the Crusader states may have fallen by the end of the 13th century, their legacy is still felt in the modern world. The impact of these states is not only seen in the history of warfare, but also in culture, politics, and religion. Despite their relatively short existence, the Crusader states left behind a complex legacy that shaped the course of European and Middle Eastern history. One of the most significant aspects of the Crusader states' legacy was their role in shaping European attitudes toward the East. The Crusaders, who were predominantly European knights and soldiers, saw themselves as the defenders of Christianity in the Holy Land. Their efforts to establish Christian kingdoms in the Levant were deeply tied to the idea of reclaiming Jerusalem and the Holy Land for Christianity. This idea of a Christian mission in the East had a profound effect on European religious and political thought for centuries. The Crusader states also played a key role in the cultural exchange between the East and West. While the Crusaders were focused on military conquest, they were also exposed to new ideas, technologies, and ways of life that they had never encountered before. The Crusaders brought back with them valuable knowledge from the Muslim world, particularly in areas such as science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Many of these ideas were later integrated into European thought, contributing to the intellectual and scientific advancements of the Renaissance. Moreover, the Crusader states acted as a cultural bridge between the two worlds. Although the Crusaders were often in conflict with the Muslim world, they also had moments of cooperation and exchange. The Crusaders learned from the Muslims in areas like architecture, art, and trade. The Crusader castles, for example, were influenced by Islamic architecture, and many Crusader cities were built with the knowledge of Islamic engineering and design. This cultural blending, though often overlooked, had a lasting impact on both Christian and Muslim societies. Politically, the Crusader states also had an influence on the rise of European colonialism. The idea of establishing Christian kingdoms in foreign lands was not entirely lost after the fall of the Crusader states. In fact, the Crusaders' experience in the Holy Land served as a model for later European imperial ventures. The Spanish and Portuguese empires, for example, were inspired by the Crusader states' example when they began their own campaigns of conquest in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The idea of spreading Christianity and establishing European rule in distant lands became central to the colonial mindset, echoing the Crusaders' goals in the Levant. Additionally, the Crusader states played a significant role in the history of the military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These religious military orders were initially formed to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. However, after the fall of the Crusader states, these orders continued to have an impact on European history, particularly in the medieval period. The Knights Templar, in particular, became legendary for their wealth and power, and their mysterious downfall in the early 14th century continues to fascinate historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Despite their eventual defeat, the Crusader states' quest for Jerusalem continued to influence European geopolitics for centuries. The idea of reclaiming Jerusalem remained a symbol of Christian unity and power, and it was invoked by many subsequent European leaders. Even after the Crusader states were gone, the idea of Christian control over Jerusalem persisted, especially during periods of European religious and military conflict. Finally, the Crusader States also left a lasting imprint on the Middle East. The Crusaders' presence in the region, though brief, had a profound impact on the local Muslim, Jewish, and Christian populations. The legacy of the Crusaders is still felt in the cultural, religious, and political landscapes of the Middle East today. The Crusaders' interactions with the local populations, whether through conflict, trade, or diplomacy, shaped the development of the region in ways that continue to be seen in modern conflicts and cultural exchanges. The history of the Crusader states has long been a subject of fascination and debate. While these states are often remembered for their military conquests and the religious zeal that drove them, their legacy has also become a point of reflection in modern times. How do we view the Crusaders today? Are they heroes defending the faith, or invaders seeking control of foreign lands? In modern historical discussions, the Crusader states are often viewed through a complex lens. On one hand, they were the product of a time when religion and politics were inextricably linked. The Crusaders were not only military leaders but also devout Christians, and their campaigns were framed as religious wars aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. To many, they were seen as champions of Christianity, fighting to secure a sacred land. To others, they were conquerors who inflicted violence upon the Muslim world and other non-Christian populations. Today, the Crusader states are often interpreted as part of the larger Crusades, a series of religious wars that span centuries. Historians debate the motivations behind these wars, with some viewing them as an inevitable result of the religious and cultural clashes between the Christian and Muslim worlds. Others argue that the Crusades were fueled by political ambitions and economic greed, with the Crusaders seeking power, land, and wealth, rather than solely religious salvation. The legacy of the Crusader states has also influenced how we view Western involvement in the Middle East today. In a region long marked by conflict, the Crusader states are often seen as an early example of foreign powers, attempting to impose their own ideals and control over the region. This idea of Western imperialism is a recurring theme in modern political discussions, especially in relation to the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. The Crusaders' attempt to dominate the Holy Land is often viewed as an early manifestation of Western efforts to intervene in the affairs of the Middle East, a theme that continues to play out in contemporary geopolitics. The Crusader states also contribute to the modern understanding of religious conflict. The Crusades and the establishment of the Crusader states were largely framed as a conflict between Christianity and Islam. This dichotomy of us versus them has had a lasting impact on the way the world views religious divides. The Crusaders' conquest of Jerusalem and their interactions with Muslim rulers, such as Saladin, remain a powerful symbol of the religious tensions that continue to shape modern-day conflicts. However, it's essential to also acknowledge the cultural and intellectual exchange that took place during the Crusader period. While the Crusades are often remembered for their violence and destruction, they also served as a bridge for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and goods between the East and West. The Crusaders, through their contact with the Muslim world, brought back knowledge of medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. Many of these ideas contributed to the European Renaissance, a period of great cultural and intellectual flourishing. In this sense, the Crusader states were not only a military enterprise, but also an avenue for the enrichment of European society. The modern portrayal of the Crusader states also reflects popular culture's interest in medieval history. In books, films, and video games, the Crusaders are often depicted as heroic knights, fighting for a noble cause. This romanticized version of the Crusades, while not entirely inaccurate, overlooks the complexities and brutality of these wars. Films like Kingdom of Heaven and novels such as The Templar Legacy have helped to shape the modern image of the Crusaders as figures of adventure and honor. Yet these depictions often fail to fully capture the negative impact of the Crusades on the local populations, both Muslim and Christian, in the Levant. In the Middle East, the legacy of the Crusader states is viewed through a very different lens. For many, the Crusaders' invasion of Jerusalem and their establishment of Christian kingdoms in the Levant are seen as foreign occupation. The Crusaders were often remembered not for their piety or religious devotion, but for their violence and oppression. The Crusader states, despite their short-lived success, have become a symbol of Western colonialism in the region, a reminder of the long history of foreign intervention in the Middle East. The Crusader States are also significant in the context of modern-day religious dialogue. The tensions between Christianity and Islam that were at the heart of the Crusades are still present in today's world, though in a very different form. The Crusades are often invoked in discussions about the relationship between the West and the Muslim world, particularly in the context of conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader struggle for control over sacred sites. The historical events of the Crusader period continue to resonate in these discussions, illustrating how past conflicts can shape current issues. As we reflect on the Crusader States, it's clear that their history is far from simple. They were both conquerors and protectors, both builders and destroyers. Their impact on the course of history is undeniable, but their legacy is still being shaped and debated in the modern world. The Crusader States are a reminder that history is never black and white. It's filled with complexities, its contradictions, and enduring consequences. The story of the Crusader States is more than just a tale of military conquests, religious zeal, and political ambition. It holds valuable lessons for us today, particularly in understanding the complexities of war, religion, and the interplay between cultures. The Crusaders were not just soldiers, they were pioneers in a new world of cultural exchange, its political strife and military innovation. In examining their rise and fall, we can uncover important insights that continue to resonate in modern conflicts and international relations. One of the most crucial lessons from the Crusader States is the dangers of religiously motivated conflict. The Crusades and the subsequent establishment of the Crusader States were driven by religious zeal and the belief that Christians had a divine mandate to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. While religion was the motivating factor for many crusaders, the wars also brought with them tremendous suffering for both the Christian and Muslim populations of the Levant. The Crusaders, in their quest for the Holy Land, imposed their will on local populations, often resorting to violence and oppression. Today, we can draw parallels between the Crusader States and modern conflicts driven by religious ideologies, whether in the Middle East or other parts of the world. Wars fueled by religion often lead to division, bloodshed, and long-lasting resentment. The Crusader States serve as a stark reminder of how religion, when combined with political ambition, can lead to destructive consequences. In today's world, it is important to recognize the dangers of allowing religion to become a justification for violence, as this can perpetuate cycles of hatred and intolerance. Another key lesson is the importance of cultural exchange and cooperation. Despite the violent nature of the Crusades, the Crusader States were also a site for the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and technologies between the Christian and Muslim worlds. Crusaders encountered the advanced sciences, medicine, and architecture of the Muslim world, and many of these ideas made their way back to Europe. The Crusader States, for all their conflicts, were a meeting point for different cultures, and this exchange had a lasting impact on both worlds. In the modern world, the idea of cultural exchange is more important than ever. In our increasingly globalized society, it is vital that nations and peoples from different cultures engage with one another, learn from each other, and share ideas. The legacy of the Crusader States reminds us that cooperation and dialogue, rather than conflict, can lead to progress and mutual understanding. By fostering cultural exchange, we can break down the barriers that often divide us and build bridges between communities. The Crusader States also teach us about the fragility of empires. Though the Crusader States were initially successful in establishing powerful kingdoms in the Levant, their grip on power was always tenuous. Internal divisions, external threats, and shifting political alliances eventually led to their downfall. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was a turning point, but it wasn't the end. Even after the Crusaders' defeat, they continued to fight for their place in the Holy Land. But their power was never the same. This fragility of power is something we can apply to modern politics. Whether in international relations or the rise and fall of nations, the Crusader States remind us that empires, no matter how strong they seem, can fall if they are not careful in managing their resources, alliances, and internal divisions. In today's world, the lesson is clear. Power is not guaranteed, and maintaining it requires constant vigilance, adaptability, and an understanding of the shifting dynamics of global politics. In addition, the history of the Crusader States also underscores the importance of unity and leadership. The Crusader States were often divided by infighting, with different factions vying for control over territories and power. This internal strife weakened their ability to defend against external threats such as the Mamluks and Saladin. If the Crusader states had been more unified, perhaps their grip on the Holy Land could have lasted longer. Modern leaders can learn from this. Divisive politics and infighting weaken a nation's ability to respond to challenges, both at home and abroad. In an era where global threats are ever present, whether from terrorism, climate change, or economic instability, nations must prioritize unity and strong leadership to overcome these obstacles. Just as the Crusader states were unable to fend off external threats due to internal conflict, modern nations must work to prevent division and ensure a unified approach to governance and global challenges. The collapse of the Crusader states also highlights the cyclical nature of history. Just as the Crusaders came to the Holy Land with the goal of establishing Christian rule, their eventual fall demonstrates the shifting tides of power in history. The Crusader states' rise and fall mirror other empires and kingdoms throughout history. What once seemed indomitable can be overturned, and what seems impossible to overcome can sometimes endure. For modern societies, this serves as a reminder that no power or system is permanent. Historical cycles show that those who do not adapt to changing circumstances or learn from past mistakes are often doomed to repeat them. This awareness is essential for ensuring that we learn from history, rather than allowing the mistakes of the past to shape the future. Lastly, the story of the Crusader states emphasizes the importance of peaceful resolutions. Despite the intense fighting, there were moments of diplomacy and negotiation. Particularly in the later years of the Crusader states' existence, the Crusaders and Muslims, most notably under the leadership of Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, occasionally reached agreements and ceasefires. These moments show that even in the most contentious conflicts, there is room for dialogue and peace. As we move forward in the 21st century, the lesson is clear. Diplomacy and negotiation are essential for resolving conflicts. War, while sometimes unavoidable, should always be a last resort. The story of the Crusader states offers a powerful reminder that even the most difficult situations can be addressed through communication and cooperation, rather than through continued violence and destruction. While the Crusader states are often remembered for their military campaigns and religious motivations, they also played a significant role in shaping the economy of the Levant and influencing trade networks that spanned across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The Crusader states, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, found themselves at the crossroads of several vital trade routes, and their control over these routes gave them both power and wealth. At the height of their power, the Crusader states controlled access to important land and sea trade routes that connected Europe with the wealth of the Middle East and Asia. The Silk Road, which had been a major route for trade between the East and West, passed through the Levant, and the Crusaders played a key role in facilitating the flow of goods between these two worlds. Goods such as spices, silk, textiles, and precious metals were transported along these trade routes, and the Crusader states acted as intermediaries between the Muslim world and Christian Europe. The Crusaders' presence in the Levant helped to revive and expand these ancient trade routes, and their cities, particularly Acre, Jerusalem, and Antioch, became thriving centers of commerce. These cities became bustling hubs where merchants from all over the world came to buy and sell goods. The Crusader states' control over the Mediterranean coastline allowed them to control maritime trade as well, further strengthening their economic position. One of the most important economic impacts of the Crusader states was the establishment of a strong merchant class. The Crusaders established close ties with European merchants, who saw the Crusader states as an important outlet for trade in the East. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became key partners in this trade, and these Italian city-states were instrumental in providing ships, soldiers, and financial resources to the Crusader cause. In exchange, they gained access to the wealth and goods flowing through the Crusader states. The Crusader states, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, also benefited from the establishment of commercial privileges for European merchants. Many European cities and trading families were granted special privileges in the Crusader states, including tax exemptions and protection for their trade caravans. This allowed European merchants to operate with relative freedom and security, further boosting trade and the Crusaders' economy. Venice, for example, had a monopoly on trade in some regions, which greatly enriched its coffers. However, the Crusader States' control over trade was not without its challenges. Their position as intermediaries between the Christian and Muslim worlds made them vulnerable to political and military pressures from both sides. For instance, the Mamluks, after their rise to power in Egypt, in Syria, would often target Crusader-controlled trade routes and cities, disrupting the flow of goods and wealth into the region. This, in turn, had a detrimental effect on the Crusader States' economy. Another economic challenge faced by the Crusader States was the high cost of defense and military expenditures. Maintaining control over the Holy Land required constant military readiness, and the Crusaders had to spend a significant portion of their wealth on fortifications, soldiers, and weapons. The cost of defending their territory, particularly against the Muslim forces led by figures like Saladin and the Mamluks, drained the Crusader States' resources and weakened their economy. Despite these challenges, the Crusader States were also able to establish agricultural systems that supported their growing population and military needs. They implemented European-style agricultural practices in the Levant, including the cultivation of grains, fruits, and vegetables, which helped to sustain both their civilian populations and their military forces. The Crusaders also introduced new technologies in farming, such as the use of windmills and improved irrigation techniques, which boosted agricultural production in the region. The Crusader States also had a significant impact on architecture and construction. The construction of castles, churches, and fortifications throughout the Levant was a major part of their military and economic infrastructure. These structures not only served as defensive strongholds, but also as symbols of Christian authority in the region. The Crusaders' architectural influence is still evident in the region today, with many of their castles and churches remaining as important historical landmarks. Despite the fall of the Crusader States by the end of the 13th century, their economic influence continued to shape the region for centuries. The trade routes established by the Crusaders remained important for European merchants, and their legacy can be seen in the continued economic ties between Europe and the Middle East. The Crusader States also helped to lay the groundwork for the European Renaissance, as the wealth and knowledge brought back from the East played a key role in fueling the intellectual and artistic flourishing that followed. The success of the Crusader States in the Levant was heavily reliant on their ability to defend their territories and hold off a series of powerful adversaries. The Crusaders were faced with threats from multiple sides: the local Muslim forces led by figures like Saladin, the Byzantine Empire, and rival Crusader factions. As a result, the Crusaders were forced to develop highly effective military tactics and fortifications to secure their presence in the Holy Land. One of the defining features of the Crusader military was their feudal structure. The Crusader States were heavily influenced by European feudalism, and the noble lords who ruled over the Crusader States were also the commanders of their armies. These lords would rally soldiers from their lands, known as vassals, to fight in times of need. This system created a highly decentralized military structure, where each lord was responsible for his own troops, but they would unite under a common banner in times of crisis. The Crusader military was built on a combination of heavy cavalry, infantry, and siege weapons. Knights, who were at the heart of the Crusader forces, played a central role in the battles. These knights were heavily armored and fought on horseback, making them a formidable force in battle. The Crusaders also used crossbowmen and archers, who provided long-range support, and infantry units which were often composed of mercenaries or local soldiers. One of the most important aspects of Crusader military tactics was their ability to conduct sieges. The Crusader States were built around a series of fortified cities and castles, which were often the targets of Muslim armies led by figures such as Saladin. The Crusaders learned quickly how to defend their strongholds against siege attacks and developed a variety of siege techniques to protect their territory. They used a range of siege engines, including catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers, to breach the walls of enemy fortifications or defend their own. The Crusader fortifications themselves were some of the most advanced of the medieval period. Castles and citadels, such as Crackday, Chevaliers, and Margat, were designed to withstand long sieges and protect their occupants from enemy attacks. These castles were built on strategic locations, often on hilltops or near water sources, to maximize their defensive advantages. Their thick stone walls, fortified gates, and strategic layouts made them nearly impregnable, and many Crusader castles were able to withstand months of siege before eventually falling. The Crusaders' use of fortified towns and fortresses also played a critical role in their military strategy. Cities like Acre and Antioch were heavily fortified and acted as central hubs of Crusader power. These cities were often surrounded by walls and moats, and their gates were protected by multiple layers of defenses. The Crusaders built fortified suburbs around their cities to accommodate the growing population of settlers, pilgrims, and soldiers, further reinforcing their military infrastructure. The Crusaders also placed a strong emphasis on naval warfare, particularly in the Mediterranean. Control of the sea was essential to maintaining the Crusader States' supply lines and securing trade routes. The Crusaders built a powerful fleet of warships that allowed them to patrol the seas, defend their coastal cities, and launch attacks on enemy positions. Venetian and Genoese fleets played a significant role in this. Their naval expertise was crucial in the Crusaders' ability to maintain a foothold in the region. Despite these impressive military strategies and fortifications, the Crusader states were not invincible. As the Crusader states expanded, their enemies adapted and developed new tactics to counter the Crusaders' strengths. Saladin, for example, was a master tactician who used his deep knowledge of the terrain to launch surprise attacks on Crusader strongholds. He often employed hit-and-run tactics, ambushing Crusader forces and causing significant damage to their supply lines. The Crusaders, however, were not without their own setbacks. Internal division within the Crusader states, combined with external pressures, weakened their ability to hold on to their land. The Crusaders' reliance on European knights and their feudal structure meant that they were often ill-prepared for prolonged warfare in a foreign land. In addition, the Crusaders' reliance on mercenaries and foreign forces created a lack of unity and commitment to their cause, further undermining their military position. Despite these challenges, the Crusaders' military architecture and siege tactics remained highly influential throughout the medieval period. The Crusader castles, in particular, became models for other military fortifications in Europe and the Near East. The advanced techniques used by the Crusaders in siege warfare and fortification construction would be adopted by future generations of military engineers and architects. The Crusader states, once powerful and influential in the Levant, began to experience a gradual but undeniable decline from the late 12th century onward. Although they initially thrived due to their military successes, strong alliances, and strategic control over key territories, a combination of internal divisions, external pressures, and shifting geopolitics led to their eventual downfall. One of the primary factors in the decline of the Crusader states was their inability to maintain a unified front. The Crusader states were composed of several smaller kingdoms, counties, and principalities, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. Each of these regions was ruled by different factions, often with competing interests. Although the Crusaders shared a common goal of holding the Holy Land, their differing priorities and internal rivalries weakened their ability to mount a coordinated defense against external threats. A key moment in the Crusader states' decline came with the loss of the County of Edessa in 1144 to the Seljuk Turks. Edessa was the first Crusader state to be established, and its loss was a devastating blow to the Crusader presence in the Levant. This event not only weakened the Crusaders' position, but also prompted the Second Crusade, a failed military campaign led by European monarchs, which further strained the Crusader states' resources and military strength. Another factor contributing to the decline was the rise of powerful Muslim leaders such as Saladin, who sought to unite the Muslim world and drive the Crusaders from the Levant. Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 was a pivotal moment in the Crusader states' history. This battle, which resulted in the capture of the Crusader army and the loss of most of the Crusader-held territory in the Holy Land, marked the beginning of the end for Christian rule in the region. The fall of Jerusalem shortly after was a devastating blow to the Crusaders, as the city held both spiritual and symbolic significance. While the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, managed to recapture some coastal cities, it ultimately failed to reclaim Jerusalem. The Mamluks, who rose to power in Egypt and Syria, further hastened the decline of the Crusader States. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars launched a series of military campaigns against the Crusader States using highly effective tactics in siege warfare. By the 13th century, the Crusader States were left clinging to a few coastal cities, isolated from each other and surrounded by increasingly hostile Muslim forces. The final blow came in 1291, with the fall of Acre. Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to the Mamluks after a long and brutal siege. This event marked the end of the Crusader States in the Levant, as Acre had been the last major port controlled by the Crusaders. The fall of Acre symbolized the end of over 200 years of Christian presence in the region. The Crusaders were forced to abandon the Holy Land, and many of them fled to the Mediterranean islands, particularly Cyprus, where the remnants of Crusader power continued for some time. The fall of the Crusader States had profound implications, not just for the Christian world, but for the Middle East as well. The Crusaders' defeat led to the consolidation of Muslim power in the Levant, with the Mamluks establishing themselves as the dominant force in the region. The Crusades, which had initially been driven by religious fervor and the desire to reclaim Jerusalem, ended up contributing to the rise of new political realities in the Middle East. The Crusader States' decline also highlighted the importance of external support. The Crusaders had relied heavily on European monarchs, knights, and the church for resources, troops, and financial aid. However, as European attention shifted away from the Holy Land and the Crusades lost their religious fervor, the Crusader States found themselves increasingly isolated and without the necessary reinforcements to defend against growing Muslim opposition. Internally, the Crusader States also faced challenges in maintaining their political and military cohesion. The feudal system that governed the Crusader States led to a fragmented and often inefficient leadership. Disputes over land, power, and succession were frequent, and these internal divisions left the Crusaders vulnerable to both external and internal threats. Additionally, the Crusaders' inability to assimilate with the local population, many of whom were Muslims, Jews, or Eastern Christians, meant that they were often perceived as foreign invaders, which further alienated them from the local populace. While the Crusader States were officially dismantled by the late 13th century, their influence lingered. The Crusader legacy continued to shape European thinking about the East and the religious conflict between Christianity and Islam. The Crusades also laid the groundwork for future European explorations and colonial ventures, as the idea of expanding European influence beyond its borders remained a driving force in the centuries to come. Though the Crusader States were short-lived, their cultural impact resonated far beyond their collapse in the late 13th century. The Crusaders' presence in the Levant not only shaped the political landscape of the Middle East, but also had a lasting influence on the culture, art, architecture, and intellectual life of both Europe and the Muslim world. The legacy of the Crusader States is especially significant in the context of Western civilization, as they contributed to the intellectual and cultural developments of the Renaissance and beyond. One of the most notable cultural contributions of the Crusader States was their role in facilitating cultural exchange between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusaders, many of whom were knights and soldiers from Western Europe, encountered a wealth of knowledge, art, and science in the East. During their time in the Levant, they were exposed to Muslim advancements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. These intellectual treasures, which had flourished in the Islamic world for centuries, were largely unknown to Western Europe until the Crusaders came into contact with them. The translations of Arabic texts into Latin were one of the most significant results of this cultural exchange. Crusaders brought back scientific and philosophical works by Muslim scholars such as Avicenna ibn Sina, Aurangzeb, and Evrozib Rusht, which had been preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. These texts, which included works on medicine, philosophy, and mathematics, were translated into Latin and became a key part of the intellectual revival that would characterize the Renaissance. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge through Arabic translations helped to fuel the intellectual and scientific revolution in Europe, contributing to advancements in fields like medicine, chemistry, and engineering. In addition to intellectual exchange, the Crusaders' time in the Levant also left a significant mark on art and architecture. Crusader castles and fortifications, such as Krak-Day, Chevaliers, and Acre, were constructed using advanced techniques learned from the Muslim world. Islamic architecture, with its intricate designs, domed structures, and geometric patterns, had a profound influence on the Crusaders' architectural style. Crusader architecture in the Levant blended Gothic and Islamic elements, resulting in a distinctive style that was both functional and beautiful. These castles and fortresses not only served as military strongholds, but also as symbols of Christian power in a foreign land. The Crusader States also played a pivotal role in the development of Christian art. During the Crusades, Crusaders commissioned religious paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that depicted biblical scenes and Christian saints. These works of art were often heavily influenced by Eastern motifs and iconography, blending Christian religious themes with the vibrant styles of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The Crusader state served as a bridge between Eastern and Western art traditions, with Crusaders bringing back Eastern artistic techniques and ideas to Europe. Moreover, the Crusader states were instrumental in the development of military orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, which became powerful institutions in medieval Europe. These orders, initially formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, expanded their influence and played a major role in the politics, finance, and military affairs of Europe. The Knights Templar, in particular, became one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, establishing a network of fortresses, banks, and trade routes. Their impact on European financial systems and their mysterious legacy have continued to captivate historians and the public alike. In terms of trade, the Crusader states also helped to re-establish important trade routes between Europe and the East. The Crusaders' control over key ports along the Mediterranean, including Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre, enabled them to facilitate the flow of goods between Europe, the Levant, and Asia. Spices, silk, precious metals, and textiles were among the goods that were traded. And the Crusaders' involvement in this commerce contributed to the wealth of European trading cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. The Crusader states thus played a key role in reviving Mediterranean trade networks that had been disrupted by the collapse of the Roman Empire. Additionally, the Crusader states had a lasting influence on the history of warfare. The Crusaders' military tactics, use of heavy cavalry, and innovative siege techniques were studied and adapted by later European armies. The construction of castles and fortifications in the Crusader states also set the stage for the development of military architecture throughout medieval Europe. Crusader knights became legendary for their combat skills and their role in establishing military orders, many of which persisted long after the Crusader states were gone. Perhaps one of the most enduring cultural legacies of the Crusader states was their impact on Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Though the Crusaders ultimately lost control of Jerusalem, the idea of visiting the Holy Land remained a central religious goal for Christians in Europe. The Crusader states had established a network of pilgrimage routes and sacred sites. And even after the fall of Jerusalem, the desire to visit these sites continued to shape the religious life of Europe. The idea of pilgrimage and religious travel would remain an important part of Christian culture throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The Crusader states were not isolated kingdoms. From the very beginning, they were shaped by a complex web of political and diplomatic relations, both with other Christian powers in Europe and with the Muslim world. The Crusaders, having come from Europe with a shared goal of reclaiming Jerusalem and the Holy Land, quickly realized that their survival depended on more than just military conquest. It required alliances, diplomacy, and the careful management of relations with both neighboring kingdoms and distant powers. One of the most important aspects of the Crusader states' diplomatic efforts was their relationship with the Byzantine Empire. While the Crusaders and the Byzantines shared a common Christian faith, their relationship was marked by tension and distrust. The Byzantine Empire, led by Emperor Alexios, the First Komnenos, had initially called for the First Crusade in 1095, hoping to regain lost territory and to strengthen the empire. However, the Crusaders' arrival in the Levant and their subsequent conquests were seen by many Byzantines as a challenge to their authority in the East. The Crusaders, for their part, often viewed the Byzantine Empire with suspicion. The Byzantines were seen as a potential rival for control of the Levant, and their reluctance to provide full support to the Crusaders, especially during the First Crusade, created lasting animosity. The Crusaders and the Byzantines would often find themselves at odds, and political rivalries continued to influence the Crusader States' efforts to maintain a foothold in the region. This rivalry would ultimately contribute to the fracturing of the Crusader effort, as the Crusaders found themselves unable to rely on Byzantine support during critical moments in their struggle for the Holy Land. Despite this, there were moments of cooperation. The Crusaders, particularly those in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, made attempts to maintain diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire, particularly when facing common enemies like the Seljuk Turks. In fact, during the reign of King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, there were attempts to create a closer relationship with the Byzantine Empire, and Baldwin even arranged a marriage between his daughter and a Byzantine prince. However, these efforts were short-lived and often undermined by mistrust and strategic differences. The Crusader states also engaged in diplomacy with other Christian kingdoms in Europe, such as the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Kingdom of England. European monarchs and nobles had a vested interest in the success of the Crusader states, not only for religious reasons, but also for political and economic gain. The Crusaders, by controlling access to the Holy Land, acted as gatekeepers for European interests in the region. The Catholic Church also played a crucial diplomatic role in this relationship, as it used its influence to mobilize support for the Crusades, secure financing, and broker alliances. One of the most notable diplomatic efforts by the Crusader states was the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, which was launched in response to the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin. During this crusade, some of the most powerful monarchs of Europe, Richard, the Lionheart of England, Philip II, Augustus of France, and Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, participated in the military campaign, all with the goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. Although the Crusaders achieved some victories, such as the capture of Acre, the failure to recapture Jerusalem led to a diplomatic resolution between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. The two leaders reached a truce, allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, while leaving the city under Muslim control. This truce demonstrated that diplomacy, even between sworn enemies, could sometimes achieve more than prolonged warfare. The Crusader states also interacted with the Muslim world in a variety of ways. While their relationship was primarily defined by conflict, diplomacy and trade were not absent from their interactions. Leaders like Saladin were not only military commanders, but also skilled diplomats who understood the importance of alliances and negotiations. Saladin's relationship with the Crusader states was complex. While he was committed to driving the Crusaders out of the Levant, he also engaged in negotiations with them when it served his strategic interests. After the fall of Jerusalem, Saladin offered peace terms to the Crusaders, allowing them to leave the city with their lives, a gesture that was rooted in diplomacy, even in the midst of conflict. The Crusader states also established relations with other Muslim dynasties in the region. These relationships were often pragmatic, with the Crusaders seeking alliances with local Muslim rulers to ensure the security of their territories. In some cases, Crusader leaders forged temporary alliances with Muslim states, especially when facing common threats from other Muslim factions. For example, the Crusaders and the Fatimids of Egypt, despite their religious differences, occasionally worked together to combat the Seljuks and other external invaders. Throughout the existence of the Crusader states, the need for alliances and diplomatic recognition from powerful kingdoms and empires was essential to their survival. The Crusader states were always vulnerable to external threats, whether from the Muslim world or from rival Christian powers. Diplomacy was often the difference between survival and collapse, and the Crusaders knew that military victories alone could not secure their long-term presence in the region. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the collapse of the Crusader states, and ended any hopes of further Crusader expansion in the Levant. Yet the diplomatic relationships that the Crusaders had forged during their time in the region left an indelible mark on the history of the Middle East. The Crusaders' diplomatic efforts while ultimately unsuccessful in preserving their presence in the Holy Land, were part of a broader history of interaction between different cultures, religions, and political systems. The Crusader States, though established far from Europe, had a profound impact on the development of European identity and the collective consciousness of medieval Christians. The idea of the Crusader States, with their mission to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land, became intertwined with the European understanding of Christianity, chivalry, and the concept of the Holy War. For centuries after the fall of the Crusader States, the idea of the Crusades would remain an integral part of European identity, influencing both the religious and cultural trajectory of the continent. At the core of the Crusader States' existence was the notion of Christian duty. For many Europeans, participating in the Crusades was seen as a religious obligation, divine calling to fight for the faith and to reclaim the holy sites of Christianity. The Crusader States, in many ways, embodied this religious zeal. They were not just military outposts, they were seen as fortresses of faith, where Christians could fight and die in the service of God. This sense of religious mission became deeply ingrained in the European psyche, shaping the continent's views on religious conflict for generations to come. The idea of the Crusader Knight also became an enduring symbol of European identity. The Crusader Knights, many of whom were members of powerful European noble families, were seen as the epitome of chivalric virtues: bravery, honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. The image of the knight, armed and ready to defend the Christian faith, was romanticized in literature, art, and later in folklore. These knights were celebrated not only for their military prowess, but also for their commitment to the ideals of Christian chivalry, which emphasized protection of the weak, the defense of the faith, and the pursuit of justice. This idealized version of the knight would go on to influence European medieval culture. From the Arthurian legends to the age of knights and castles that dominated the Middle Ages, the role of the Church in the Crusader States also contributed to the shaping of European identity. Catholic Church, led by the Pope, played a pivotal role in initiating and financing the Crusades. The Pope's call for the First Crusade in 1095 was not just a call to arms. It was a religious and spiritual summons to all Christians in Europe. The Church's involvement in the Crusader States further cemented the idea of the Holy War, where war was no longer just a political or military endeavor, but a divinely ordained mission. This notion of religiously justified warfare would have a lasting impact on European thinking about war and peace, and it influenced future conflicts, both within Europe and in the wider world. The Crusader States also played a role in shaping European ideas of territorial expansion and the concept of empire. The Crusaders' efforts to establish Christian kingdoms in the Levant set a precedent for later European expansion into other parts of the world. In many ways, the Crusades provided a model for colonization, with the Crusaders viewing the lands of the Holy Land as both a religious and strategic prize. The idea of establishing Christian rule in foreign territories would be revisited by European powers during the Age of Exploration, as they sought to expand their influence and spread Christianity to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The legacy of the Crusader States contributed to the European desire to extend their dominion over distant lands in the name of faith. The Crusader States also reinforced the notion of a unified Christian Europe. The Crusades were seen as a collective European effort, with knights, soldiers, and pilgrims coming from all over the continent to fight for a common cause. This sense of unity among European Christians, despite the various regional differences and political rivalries, was a defining feature of the Crusades. It helped to create a shared European identity, one that was centered around a common faith and a collective mission to reclaim the Holy Land. This idea of European unity, though often fragile and fleeting, would be invoked throughout European history, particularly during times of war and conflict. However, the Crusader States also contributed to a more complex relationship between Europe and the East. The Crusaders' presence in the Levant had a significant impact on how Europeans viewed the Muslim world. Initially, the Crusades were framed as a religious and military mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Over time, however, the Crusaders' interactions with Muslims, especially under leaders like Saladin, revealed a more nuanced picture. The Crusaders were not only opponents of Islam, but they were also exposed to the rich culture, knowledge, and advancements of the Islamic world. The cultural exchange that took place in the Crusader States had a lasting influence on European intellectual life, and many crusaders returned to Europe with newfound respect for Islamic scholarship and culture. This interaction between East and West, though often framed in terms of religious conflict, also paved the way for a more globalized Europe. The Crusader States served as a gateway for trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange between Europe and the Muslim world. The wealth of knowledge and goods that passed through the Crusader States contributed to the intellectual and cultural revival of Europe in the centuries that followed. The Crusades helped to open up new avenues of contact between Europe and the rest of the world, making the idea of a more interconnected global world a reality for the first time. Finally, the Crusader States helped to establish the concept of Christian pilgrimage as an essential aspect of European religious life. Even after the fall of the Crusader States, the idea of pilgrimage to the Holy Land remained a powerful force in Europe. The Crusaders had created a network of sacred sites and pilgrimage routes that drew Christians from all over Europe. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem, whether under Christian or Muslim control, remained a deeply important spiritual journey for centuries. The legacy of the Crusader States in facilitating this pilgrimage helped to shape the religious practices of European Christians and maintain the connection between Europe and the Holy Land long after the Crusader States had fallen. The Crusader States may have fallen centuries ago, but their impact on modern geopolitics and the global order is undeniable. The legacy of the Crusades continues to shape political, cultural, and religious relations between the West and the Muslim world. And their historical significance still echoes in contemporary global conflicts and diplomatic relations. One of the most enduring impacts of the Crusader States is the creation of a legacy of religious conflict that continues to play out in modern times. The Crusades, including the establishment of the Crusader States, were framed as a Christian mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The religious motivations behind the Crusades, which were endorsed by the Catholic Church, created a deep sense of division between Christianity and Islam that lasted for centuries. Though the Crusader States themselves fell, the idea of a religious war between the two faiths has continued to fuel tensions throughout history. In modern times, this legacy has been invoked in various conflicts between the Christian West and the Muslim world. For instance, the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly concerning the control of Jerusalem, can be traced back to the Crusades. The Crusaders, who viewed Jerusalem as the heart of Christianity, had established a presence there that would influence how both Christians and Muslims viewed the city to this day. The question of who controls Jerusalem remains one of the most contentious and politically charged issues in the world. The historical association between the Crusades and the struggle for Jerusalem is often used in modern-day political rhetoric, fueling divisions and justifying actions on both sides of the conflict. While the Crusader states were established for religious and territorial expansion, the long-term effects of this religious conflict have reverberated throughout history, culminating in modern disputes over sovereignty, religion, and land in the Middle East. The Crusader states also played a key role in the early development of European colonial ambitions. The concept of expanding Christian influence beyond Europe was not new to the Crusaders, and their campaigns in the Holy Land served as a model for later European colonial ventures. The Crusaders established Christian kingdoms in foreign territories, much in the same way that European empires would later establish colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Crusader states' expansionist goals were rooted in a desire for both religious supremacy and economic gain. These twin motivations would be echoed in the subsequent periods of European colonization. The idea of spreading Christianity and establishing Christian rule in foreign lands became central to European imperial ventures. European powers such as Spain, Portugal, and later Britain and France would follow in the Crusaders' footsteps, conquering new territories in the name of faith and seeking to control valuable resources and trade routes. The Crusader states' interactions with the Muslim world, especially during their time in the Levant, also laid the groundwork for modern-day political relations between Europe and the Middle East. The Crusades created a dynamic of both conflict and cooperation, as Crusaders fought against Muslim rulers like Saladin, but also engaged in diplomacy and trade. This intercultural interaction between the two civilizations was not solely limited to warfare. In fact, the Crusaders gained access to the sophisticated knowledge and technologies of the Islamic world, which would influence the European Renaissance and eventually shape the scientific revolution. In contemporary geopolitics, the long-lasting effects of these historical interactions can still be seen in Europe. As complex relationships with countries in the Middle East and North Africa, diplomatic and economic ties between the West and the Muslim world are often shaped by this history, which continues to impact attitudes and perceptions on both sides. The Crusades in particular have been invoked in modern political discourse as symbols of cultural and religious clash, where both sides often seeing themselves as heirs to the legacy of the Crusades. The rise of Islamic extremism in the modern era can also be traced, in part, to the historical memory of the Crusades. Radical groups have at times used the historical narrative of the Crusader, a conquest of Jerusalem, to fuel their own sense of identity and purpose. The perceived historical humiliation of the Muslim world at the hands of the Crusaders has been invoked in the rhetoric of groups seeking to reclaim what they believe to be the lost honor of the Muslim world. Similarly, the Crusades have been used as justification for the call to reclaim sacred sites and to defend Islam against perceived threats from the West. On the European side, modern Western powers have sometimes viewed their foreign policy in the Middle East through the lens of the Crusades, whether consciously or not. The United States military involvement in the Middle East, particularly after the events of 9/11, has been perceived by some in the Muslim world as a new crusade, further complicating relations between the two regions. This historical context is a powerful reminder that the Crusades' legacy continues to shape perceptions, alliances, and conflicts in today's world. Moreover, the Crusader States' legacy also touches upon the idea of global intervention. The Crusaders' attempts to impose Christian rule in the Holy Land have been mirrored in modern interventions, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, where global powers intervene in sovereign countries in the name of various causes, from humanitarian aid to democratic promotion or counterterrorism. The complexities of such interventions and their long-term effects on local populations are reminiscent of the Crusaders' actions in the Levant, well-intentioned by some, but also resulting in unintended consequences, conflicts, and political instability. In the modern world, the story of the Crusader States serves as a cautionary tale. It highlights the dangers of religiously motivated conflict, imperial overreach, and the enduring impact of historical grievances. The Crusader States' rise and fall remind us that the pursuit of power, whether through military conquest, religious fervor, or political influence, is never straightforward, and the consequences of these actions echo long after the final battles have been fought. The social fabric of the Crusader States was complex and multifaceted, shaped by both the Crusaders' European origins and the diverse cultures and peoples they encountered in the Levant. The Crusader States were a melting pot of Christian knights, local Muslim populations, Jewish communities, and Eastern Christian communities, each with their own traditions, languages, and customs. How the Crusaders interacted with these different groups both within their territories and in the broader context of the Holy Land was crucial to the success and longevity of their rule. One of the most significant challenges faced by the Crusaders was their integration into the existing social and cultural landscape of the Levant. The Crusaders came from a European feudal system, one that emphasized loyalty to a lord, military service, and land-based wealth. When they arrived in the Holy Land, they sought to establish their own feudal system in a land that had a long history of Islamic rule, with its own social and economic structures. The Christian rulers of the Crusader States tried to create a feudal society that mirrored the system they had known in Europe. Lords and knights were granted land, often taken from the Muslims, and they in turn would offer protection and military service to their superiors. Towns and villages were organized under this feudal system, with peasants and serfs working the land in exchange for protection from invading forces. However, the Crusaders' attempt to impose European feudalism was often met with resistance, particularly from the local Muslim populations. The Crusaders' feudal rule was based on the idea of a Christian hierarchy, where land and power were concentrated in the hands of a few noble families. This was a stark contrast to the more egalitarian social structures that existed in the Muslim world, where a greater emphasis was placed on the community and the collective well-being of society. The Crusaders' policies of land confiscation, taxation, control over religious sites created tensions between the ruling Christian minority and the local Muslim majority. At the same time, the Crusaders also had to navigate their relationship with the local Eastern Christians, including the Syriacs, Armenians, and Greek Orthodox Christians, who had long lived under Islamic rule. These communities had their own established traditions and were often caught between the authority of the Crusaders and the ruling Muslim powers. While the Crusaders saw themselves as protectors of Christian sites in the Holy Land, the local Christian populations had their own histories and loyalties that sometimes conflicted with the Crusader agenda. Interestingly, the Crusaders' relations with Jews in the Levant were also complex. Jews had lived in the Holy Land for centuries, under both Christian and Muslim rule, and the Crusaders' arrival introduced new challenges. During the early Crusades, particularly the First Crusade, many Jewish communities in European cities were persecuted by the Crusaders as they passed through, with mobs massacring Jews in places like Worms and Mainz. However, in the Levant, the Crusaders did not initially target Jewish communities to the same extent. Instead, they allowed Jewish communities to remain in the cities under Crusader control, albeit in a subordinate position. Jews were subject to certain restrictions, such as paying higher taxes, but they were generally tolerated as long as they did not pose a threat to the Crusaders' rule. In the Crusader States themselves, social interactions were shaped by religion, with Christianity as the dominant faith. However, the Crusaders found it difficult to enforce complete Christian unity in a region that was home to so many other faiths. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, was a patchwork of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish territories, all governed by different rules and customs. As a result, the Crusaders often had to adopt a more pragmatic approach in their governance, allowing a degree of religious freedom in the cities they controlled as long as it did not challenge their authority. In some cases, this tolerance worked to the benefit of the Crusaders, as local populations were more willing to cooperate with their rule if they were allowed to practice their faiths openly. One of the most important features of the Crusader States was their use of military orders, such as the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights. To help maintain order and protect Christian interests in the Holy Land, these orders were not just military in nature, they were also social institutions, providing a sense of unity and identity among the Crusaders. Members of these orders were bound by strict codes of conduct, which emphasized discipline, piety, and loyalty to the Christian cause. They operated hospitals, offered protection to pilgrims, and played a key role in the defense of Crusader territories. In terms of economic life, the Crusader states relied heavily on trade and commerce to maintain their wealth and power. They established commercial ties with European merchants who brought goods such as spices, wine, and cloth to the Holy Land. In exchange, Crusaders facilitated the flow of Eastern goods, including silk, cotton, and spices back to Europe. This trade created economic opportunities for both the Crusaders and local merchants. But it also caused friction, as merchants from different faiths competed for control of key trade routes in cities. However, the local population's experience under Crusader rule was not always as prosperous. The peasantry, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish Ophon, bore the brunt of the Crusader states' economic policies, which were designed to benefit the feudal lords and knights who controlled the land. Taxation, forced labor, and military service were common impositions on the local populations, and the Crusaders' feudal system often left many people living in poverty or fear of retribution. This created an atmosphere of social inequality that undermined the Crusaders' ability to establish lasting loyalty among the local population. Ultimately, the social dynamics of the Crusader states were characterized by a series of competing interests: the Crusaders' desire for land and religious dominance, the local population's desire for autonomy and protection, and the constant pressure from external forces, such as Muslim rulers and rival Christian factions. These dynamics made it difficult for the Crusader states to maintain long-term stability and contributed to their eventual collapse. The Crusader states, despite their relatively short existence, played an integral role in the development of Western culture, particularly in the realm of education and intellectual life. The Crusaders' presence in the Levant allowed for the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and innovations between the Islamic world and medieval Europe. This exchange, often mediated through the Crusader States, had far-reaching consequences that would shape the intellectual and educational developments of Europe, eventually contributing to the Renaissance and the birth of modern Western thought. One of the most significant contributions of the Crusader States to European culture was their role in transmitting Islamic knowledge back to Europe. The Muslim world, particularly during the Golden Age of Islam, made remarkable advancements in science, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Crusaders who traveled to the Holy Land encountered these innovations and were exposed to Arabic texts that preserved the works of ancient Greek and Roman scholars. Many of these texts had been lost to Europe for centuries, but the Muslims had translated and preserved them in libraries throughout the Levant. Crusaders, upon returning to Europe, brought with them manuscripts containing works by philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, and Galileo, which had been translated into Arabic. These texts provided the foundation for the intellectual revival that would occur in Europe in the following centuries. The Crusader States' role as intermediaries between the Christian and Muslim worlds helped to reintroduce Greek and Roman philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle and Ptolemy, which were central to the education of medieval scholars. The Crusaders' exposure to Islamic scholars such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, opened the door to new methods of thinking and scientific inquiry. These thinkers played a pivotal role in preserving, interpreting, and expanding upon the ideas of classical antiquity, and their works would have a lasting influence on European universities. In addition to philosophy and science, the Crusaders also brought back new ideas about medicine, Islamic medicine, which was far more advanced than its European counterpart at the time, made significant contributions to the understanding of anatomy, surgery, and medical ethics. Crusaders who studied at hospitals in the Levant, particularly those run by the Knights Hospitaller, learned advanced medical techniques and treatments that they later brought back to Europe. These innovations would gradually transform European medicine, leading to greater knowledge and improvement in healthcare practices. The Crusader States also fostered a network of scholars and translators who worked to translate Arabic, scientific, and philosophical texts into Latin. This exchange of knowledge helped to lay the foundation for the development of universities in Europe. The idea of academic study, which had largely declined in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, was revived through the Crusades. Many scholars, inspired by the work of Islamic philosophers, began to focus on integrating the ancient Greek and Roman knowledge with new insights gained from the Muslim world. This fusion of classical and Islamic knowledge became the cornerstone of European medieval universities, particularly in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, which were founded in the centuries following the Crusades. Moreover, the Crusader States were also home to cultural exchanges between different religious and ethnic groups. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and even Syriac Christian scholars lived and worked alongside one another in cities like Acre and Antioch, and these exchanges helped to create a rich intellectual and cultural environment. This interaction allowed for the cross-pollination of ideas and contributed to the growth of a more sophisticated understanding of the world, while the Crusader States themselves were often the scene of religious tension and military conflict. Their cultural and intellectual exchanges set the stage for the flourishing of European thought. The universities that sprang up across Europe in the wake of the Crusades were crucial in bringing together scholars from across the continent to study the works that had been passed down from both the classical world and the Islamic world. In terms of architecture, the Crusader States also had a lasting impact on Western Europe. Crusader architecture, particularly in the form of castles, churches, and fortresses, influenced the design of medieval European structures. The military architecture developed by the Crusaders, which often combined Islamic and Gothic styles, shaped the construction of castles and cathedrals in Europe. This architectural legacy can still be seen today in the many castles and fortifications that dot the European landscape. Furthermore, the Crusader States' contributions to the spread of knowledge and learning helped pave the way for the intellectual renaissance that would emerge. In Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, the ideas brought back from the East by the Crusaders helped to reignite a passion for learning, which in turn led to a series of advancements in art, science, literature, and philosophy. The Renaissance, often considered the beginning of the modern era in Europe, was deeply influenced by the knowledge and ideas that had been transmitted during the Crusades. Without the Crusader States' role in facilitating the exchange of knowledge, the Renaissance might not have been possible in the way that it unfolded. The Crusader States were not just military outposts, they were also intellectual and cultural bridges between East and West. Their role in preserving and transmitting knowledge had a lasting impact on European education and intellectual thought, shaping the course of European history for centuries to come. Even though the Crusader States fell, their contributions to Western civilization remained a central part of Europe's intellectual legacy, influencing the development of universities, scientific inquiry, and philosophical thought well into the modern era. The Crusader States were not merely political or military entities, they were deeply embedded in the religious ideologies of the time. The creation of these Christian kingdoms in the Levant was framed as a holy mission, with the primary goal being the reclamation of Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, from Muslim control. The religious motivations behind the Crusades were complex, and the Crusader States became the battleground where Christianity and Islam intersected in a way that had lasting effects on religious relations both during the Middle Ages and in the centuries that followed. At the core of the Crusader States' religious significance was the symbolism of Jerusalem. For Christians, the city was the birthplace of their faith, and its capture from Muslim rule was seen as the fulfillment of a divine mission. The Crusaders believed they were performing God's will by fighting to reclaim the city for Christianity. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most significant of the Crusader States, was founded as a direct result of this religious zeal. The establishment of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land became a symbol of Christian triumph, not just militarily, but spiritually. The Crusaders' success in capturing Jerusalem was seen as a victory of Christendom over Islam. For Muslims, Jerusalem was equally sacred, being the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in a key location in the Islamic faith. The Crusaders' occupation of Jerusalem was perceived as an affront to Islamic sanctity, and the struggle to reclaim the city became central to the religious identity of the Muslim world. Under Saladin, the Muslim forces managed to retake Jerusalem in 1187, a victory that not only had military and political consequences, but also carried immense religious significance. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem was a symbolic moment in the Islamic world, restoring control over one of Islam's holiest sites. The Crusader States thus represented a religious clash between Christianity and Islam that was far more than just a series of military confrontations. The wars, which began as campaigns to capture Jerusalem, evolved into a broader conflict that encompassed not only territory, but also religion, as both faiths laid claim to the same land. The Crusaders' aggressive actions against Muslims in the Holy Land, including massacres and forced conversions, further deepened the divide between the two religions. The religious zeal of the Crusaders was often accompanied by violence and religious intolerance, which fueled centuries of mistrust and hostility between Christians and Muslims. The Crusader States also had a significant impact on Christian-Muslim interactions in other areas of the Levant, beyond just the question of Jerusalem. The Crusaders controlled a number of important cities, including Acre, Antioch, and Tripoli, where they imposed Christian laws and institutions. However, they also had to engage with the local Muslim populations, many of whom had been living in the region for centuries. In some cases, the Crusaders attempted to govern with a degree of religious tolerance, allowing Muslims to practice their faith, but they often imposed strict taxation and laws that marginalized the Muslim population. The Crusaders' treatment of Muslims, along with their actions during the Crusades, became a point of contention in Christian-Muslim relations for generations. Despite the violence and conflict, there were instances of cooperation and mutual respect between Christians and Muslims in the Crusader States. For instance, after Saladin's victory in 1187, he allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem. The Crusaders who had been captured during the battle were treated with respect. This gesture of mercy was a reminder that, despite the religious and political differences, there was room for humanity and cooperation even in the midst of conflict. These moments of diplomacy, though rare, offered a glimpse into the potential for peaceful coexistence between the two religions. The Crusades and the Crusader States also played a role in the evolution of Christian religious thought. The Crusaders' presence in the Holy Land and their interactions with the Muslim world exposed them to new religious ideas, theological debates, and practices. In some cases, this led to a more intellectual approach to Christianity, as Crusaders brought back with them ideas from the Islamic world, particularly in the fields of philosophy and theology. The Crusades also helped to solidify the papal authority in Western Europe, as the Pope was the driving force behind the Crusades. The religious fervor of the Crusades provided the Catholic Church with an opportunity to assert its influence over European monarchs. As the Church was seen as the spiritual authority leading the Christian world in the fight for Jerusalem. However, the religious consequences of the Crusader states were not confined to the Christian-Muslim divide. The Jewish communities in the Levant also suffered as a result of the Crusades. As the Crusaders passed through Europe on their way to the Holy Land, they often targeted Jewish communities, subjecting them to violence, forced conversions, and massacres. Upon reaching the Holy Land, the Crusaders' hostility toward Jews did not cease, and many Jewish populations were either forced to flee or were subjected to discrimination and violence under Crusader rule. The Crusader states' religious and political policies also had long-lasting consequences for the Muslim world. The Crusades marked the beginning of a long period of Muslim resistance to European intervention in the Middle East, one that continues to resonate today. The Crusaders' violent occupation of Jerusalem and their attempts to impose Christianity on Muslim lands left a bitter legacy that would shape Muslim attitudes toward the West for centuries. This sense of resentment and rivalry between the Christian and Muslim worlds would come to a head again in later conflicts, such as the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe, and would continue to influence geopolitics in the modern era. In sum, the Crusader states were not just political entities, but were also deeply embedded in the religious conflict between Christianity and Islam. They played a central role in the centuries-long struggle for control over Jerusalem and the Holy Land. And their legacy continues to shape Christian-Muslim relations today. The interactions, both hostile and cooperative, between Christians and Muslims in the Crusader states laid the groundwork for centuries of conflict, but also for the possibility of peaceful coexistence, making the Crusader era a complex chapter in the shared religious and cultural history of the two faiths. The fall of the Crusader states in 1291 marked the end of an era in the Holy Land, but their decline had far-reaching consequences that shaped the course of future religious conflicts and influenced the long-term legacies of both Christian and Muslim powers. Although the Crusaders were ultimately expelled from the Levant, the religious and political ideologies that underpinned their campaigns did not disappear. Instead, they laid the foundation for centuries of conflict, shaping the trajectory of relations between Christianity and Islam, and leaving a lasting impact on the religious and cultural landscape of both regions. One of the most significant consequences of the Crusader states' decline was the solidification of religious divides between Christianity and Islam. The Crusaders' failure to permanently establish Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land left a bitter sense of unfinished business in the Christian world. The loss of Jerusalem, in particular, became a symbol of Christian defeat and humiliation. For centuries after the fall of the Crusader states, the idea of reclaiming the Holy Land remained a central theme in Christian thought. This notion would be revived periodically throughout history, most notably in the context of the European colonial enterprise, where Christian powers sought to expand their influence over Muslim territories and territories with significant Christian populations. For Muslims, the Crusader states' decline was a victory, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the religious and political history of the region. The Crusaders' expulsion from the Holy Land gave rise to an even stronger sense of Islamic unity and pride. Saladin's victory, which led to the reconquest of Jerusalem, became a defining moment in the history of the Muslim world. His leadership and the successful defense of Jerusalem became a symbol of resistance against foreign intervention and religious oppression. This event helped to galvanize Muslim sentiment against future attempts at Christian intervention in the Middle East. However, the decline of the Crusader states did not signal the end of religious conflict between the two faiths. The religious legacy of the Crusades would echo throughout the centuries. Even as the Crusader states fell, the idea of a Christian mission in the East was far from over. The Ottoman Empire, which had risen in the wake of the Crusader states' collapse, would become the next major power to control Jerusalem and much of the Middle East. While the Ottomans were generally more tolerant of religious diversity than the Crusaders, their rule was still often seen as a Muslim occupation by many in the Christian world. The Christian-Muslim struggle for control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land remained a defining element in European foreign policy well into the modern era. The European colonial powers of the 16th and 17th centuries, such as the Spanish, Portuguese, and later the French and British, often framed their military interventions in the Muslim world as part of a broader Christian mission. This mindset, rooted in the Crusader ideology, contributed to a long history of Christian efforts to assert control over the Middle East. The legacy of the Crusader States also continued to influence religious identity and religious conflict in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusader mentality that Jerusalem and the Holy Land were sacred Christian territories remained embedded in Western thought, influencing not only religious debates, but also political movements. In the Muslim world, the memory of the Crusades and the Crusader States served as a reminder of the importance of defending Islam from foreign invaders. The image of the Crusaders as Christian invaders, who had come to desecrate Muslim holy sites, became a powerful symbol of Islamic resistance. In the 20th century, this religious legacy was invoked during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As both Jews and Muslims laid claim to Jerusalem, the Crusader legacy provided historical context for the struggle over Jerusalem, reinforcing the idea of the city as a battleground between the two faiths. The Holy Land became a focal point for both religious and political claims, and the Crusader States' history added a layer of complexity to this long-standing dispute. The Crusader legacy also played a role in the development of European Christian missions to the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas. The idea of spreading Christianity, whether through military conquest, colonization, or missionary work, was heavily influenced by the Crusader ethos. The Crusades had created a deeply ingrained belief in the divine right of Christians to spread their faith across the world, and this would remain a central tenet of European expansionism for centuries. Moreover, the Crusades and the Crusader States left behind a legacy of religious intolerance that would fuel future conflicts. The brutality of the Crusades, which included massacres of Muslims and Jews, created a cycle of hatred and resentment that would resurface in later centuries. The medieval religious wars laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation and subsequent religious conflicts in Europe. These wars, although not directly related to the Crusader States, were influenced by the same ideological divides between Christians and those who were perceived as religious enemies. In the Muslim world, the Crusader States' decline ushered in an era of Islamic consolidation and expansion. The memory of the Crusader threat played a role in fostering a sense of Islamic unity under leaders such as Saladin and later Ottoman rulers, who saw themselves as the protectors of Islamic lands against foreign powers. While the Ottomans generally pursued a policy of religious tolerance, the memory of the Crusades still shaped Muslim attitudes toward European powers. In essence, the fall of the Crusader States was not the end of the religious conflict it had engendered. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the Christian-Muslim relationship, one that would be defined by continued competition for control of the Holy Land, religious identity, and cultural dominance. The Crusader States' legacy endured in the hearts and minds of those who lived through these tumultuous times, and their influence continues to be felt in religious, political, and social conflicts to this day. The decline and fall of the Crusader States did not signal the end of the Crusaders' ambitions or the religious zeal that had motivated their campaigns. Instead, the legacy of the Crusader States persisted and found new expressions in the age of exploration and European imperialism. As European powers expanded their influence across the world, many of the ideals and motivations that had driven the Crusades, such as the desire to spread Christianity, establish Christian rule in foreign lands, and reclaim holy sites, reappeared in the form of imperial conquests and missionary efforts. The fall of the Crusader States thus laid the foundation for centuries of European overseas expansion, which was often framed in terms of continuing the mission of the Crusaders. The Crusader States' pursuit of religious and territorial conquest in the Levant served as a model for the later European imperialist powers. The idea of Christian dominion over foreign lands became central to European colonial ambitions. Whether through the spread of Christianity or the pursuit of economic gain, European powers in the Age of Exploration sought to establish control over lands and peoples far from Europe. Just as the Crusaders had seen themselves as spreading the Christian faith by establishing Christian kingdoms in the Levant, European imperial powers sought to impose Christianity on indigenous peoples across Africa, the Americas, and Asia. One of the most obvious continuations of the Crusader ideals in the Age of Exploration was the belief that Christianity had a divine mandate to spread throughout the world. The Crusaders' religious mission to reclaim the Holy Land became an inspiration for European missionaries and explorers. The Spanish and Portuguese, in particular, viewed their expeditions to the Americas, Africa, and Asia as part of their duty to spread Christianity. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires in the Americas, for example, was framed as a continuation of the crusading mission, a religious duty to convert and civilize non-Christians. This notion of a Christian mission also influenced European imperial policies in Africa and Asia. European colonial powers, including the British, French, and Dutch, justified their expansion into non-Christian territories as part of their moral obligation to spread Christianity. Just as the Crusaders had built castles, churches, and fortifications to solidify their control over the Holy Land, the European imperial powers built churches, schools, and missionary stations in their colonies to reinforce their religious and cultural authority. The idea of the Crusader as a knight fighting in a holy war was romanticized during this time and transferred to the figure of the European imperialist, who sought to bring civilization and Christianity to the dark corners of the world. However, it is important to note that, just like the Crusaders in the Levant, European imperialists did not always succeed in their religious goals. Many of the indigenous peoples they encountered in the Americas, Africa, and Asia resisted attempts at conversion, often withstood European attempts to impose religious and political control. While the Crusaders' mission in the Levant ultimately failed to establish lasting Christian rule, the legacy of the Crusades continued to fuel the idea of Christian conquest in new contexts. The Crusader States, though they fell, had instilled the belief that Christian kingdoms could be established in foreign lands, and this belief was carried forward by European explorers and colonial rulers. Despite the religious justification for imperialism, the economic motivations behind European expansion cannot be overlooked. Much like the Crusaders, European imperial powers sought to control key trade routes and valuable resources. The desire for wealth, particularly through the establishment of trade routes and the acquisition of land and resources, was a major driving force behind European imperialism. The Crusaders had sought to control the trade routes that passed through the Levant, particularly those that connected Europe with the riches of the East. Similarly, European imperialists sought to control trade routes that connected Europe with the Americas, Africa, and Asia, often establishing monopolies over valuable goods such as spices, gold, and slaves. The Crusader States' role in the establishment of trade networks across the Mediterranean was particularly important in shaping European imperial ambitions. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisuich had been crucial in financing and supporting the Crusades, became powerful maritime republics during the Age of Exploration. These city-states used their naval power and commercial networks to establish trade links with the East and later the New World. Just as the Crusaders had sought to control the ports and trade routes of the Levant, European imperial powers sought to control the ports and trade routes of the Americas, Africa, and Asia, while the Crusaders were eventually pushed out of the Levant. Their ideological legacy lived on in the efforts of European imperialists. The Crusaders' vision of a Christian-dominated world, with Jerusalem at its spiritual center, was reinterpreted by European powers as they sought to expand their influence over known Christian lands. This idea of spreading Christianity and Western civilization became central to the European colonial mission, influencing both the rhetoric and the actions of imperial rulers. Furthermore, the Crusader States' legacy can also be seen in the development of military orders and mercenaries, which continued to play a significant role in European wars and imperial conquests. The Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights were originally founded to defend Christian territories in the Levant, but their influence extended far beyond the Crusades. These military orders evolved into powerful and wealthy organizations that played a significant role in the politics and military affairs of European kingdoms. Even after the fall of the Crusader States, these orders continued to operate in Europe and the New World, often providing military support and engaging in colonial campaigns. In conclusion, the fall of the Crusader States did not mark the end of the Crusader mission. Instead, it was absorbed into the broader narrative of European expansion. The Crusader States' religious zeal, imperial ambitions, and cultural exchanges were integrated into the ideology of European imperialism during the Age of Exploration. The mission to spread Christianity, the quest for territorial control, and the desire for economic gain continued to drive European powers long. After the Crusaders left the Levant, ensuring that the legacy of the Crusader States would resonate in the imperial ventures of the modern world. The fall of the Crusader States in the late 13th century marked the end of an era. For nearly 200 years, these states had represented the Christian world's efforts to establish dominance in the Holy Land, symbolizing both the heights of Christian ambition and the limitations of its reach. Their collapse in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, brought an end to the physical presence of Christian kingdoms in the Levant. But the legacy of the Crusades and the memory of the Crusader States has endured through the centuries, influencing both Christian and Muslim worlds. Despite the loss of the Crusader States, the memory of the Crusades continued to be a powerful force in the cultural and religious imagination of both Europeans and Muslims. For centuries, the Crusader States remained symbolic of the Christian struggle to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The loss of these states became a rallying cry for later European military campaigns. Whether during the Age of Exploration, when European powers sought to expand their influence into Muslim-controlled territories, or during the colonial era, when the legacy of Crusaderism was invoked to justify imperialism, for Muslims, the fall of the Crusader States represented a major victory. But the memory of the Crusaders' campaigns remained a source of tension. The Crusaders were seen as invaders who had desecrated holy Muslim sites and imposed foreign rule over their lands. The memory of the Crusader States' occupation was deeply etched into the collective consciousness of the Muslim world, contributing to the legacy of Islamic resistance against foreign invaders. The battle to reclaim Jerusalem lost to the Crusaders became emblematic of broader themes of Islamic unity and resilience. Themes that would later be invoked by leaders like Saladin during the Crusades, and much later during the struggles against Western imperialism. The Crusader legacy also remained a point of historical reflection in Europe, where the Crusades were often framed as both a tragic failure and a divine mission. The papal authority and the Church's central role in organizing the Crusades continued to be a source of contention in the centuries following the fall of the Crusader States. While the Crusades were initially justified as a holy mission, the violence, bloodshed, and destruction they caused were increasingly criticized by later European scholars, philosophers, and reformers. The memory of the Crusades would continue to influence Christian thought and the relationship between church and state, especially during periods of reform and secularization. The Crusader States' collapse did not only signify a military defeat, but also marked the shift in the balance of power in the Middle East. The rise of the Mamluks and the Ottoman Empire, after the Crusader States, declined further, established Islamic dominance in the region. These empires would go on to shape the course of Middle Eastern history for centuries. In particular, the Ottomans would carry the banner of Islamic expansion, establishing a vast empire that spanned much of southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire's control of Jerusalem for centuries after the fall of the Crusader States reinforced the city's status as a key symbol for both Muslims and Christians. Despite the collapse of the Crusader States, the idea of the Crusades continued to influence the politics and religious outlook of the Christian world. The concept of holy war and the religious justification for military intervention remained prominent themes, especially during the later centuries of European expansionism. The Crusader mindset, which sought to spread Christianity by force, continued to influence European colonialism in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The imagery of the Crusaders as knights defending the faith was often romanticized in European literature and art, and the historical memory of the Crusades was used to justify the later imperial wars and missionary efforts of European powers. Moreover, the Crusader legacy continued to shape the relationship between Christianity and Islam in the modern world. Even in the 21st century, the memory of the Crusades still resonates in political discourse, particularly in relation to conflicts in the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which revolves around control of Jerusalem, continues to evoke the religious tensions that began during the Crusader era. The idea of Jerusalem as a holy city has remained central to both Christian and Muslim identities, and the history of the Crusades continues to inform the rhetoric surrounding modern geopolitical struggles. The legacy of the Crusader States is also reflected in modern popular culture. Movies, books, and video games often romanticize the Crusades and the figures of the Crusaders, portraying them as knights on a noble mission. While these depictions often overlook the violence and brutality of the Crusades, they contribute to the enduring fascination with the period. The Crusader legacy continues to shape the cultural imagination, influencing everything from historical fiction to political ideology. The Crusader States collapse while marking the end of an era in the Holy Land, thus left a complex and enduring legacy. Their brief but intense presence in the Levant influenced centuries of religious, political, and cultural developments, from the rise of European imperialism to the ongoing religious and political struggles in the Middle East. The memory of the Crusader States, their religious zeal, and their failure to secure lasting Christian rule continues to reverberate in modern history and politics, making the Crusades an indelible chapter in the story of both Christianity and Islam.